Four teenagers went to sleep inside a single canvas tent on the shore of Lake Bodom. By sunrise, three of them were dead, and the fourth was found sitting outside the collapsed tent, alive, with injuries to his face and no clear memory of what had happened. The tent had been slashed and pushed down over the bodies from the outside. No weapon was ever recovered at the scene. How does an attacker kill three people inside a small tent, leave one survivor breathing a few meters away, and vanish into a Finnish forest at dawn without leaving a single reliable footprint? The first serious clue would not surface for more than 40 years. Tonight we walk through the timeline hour by hour, the three main suspects Finnish police built cases against, and the four physical details the investigation could never explain. Detail number 3 is the one veteran investigators still argue about today. If you follow cases like this, subscribe. We cover a new unsolved case every week. To understand what happened at Lake Bodom, you first have to understand how ordinary the night was supposed to be. It was early June 1960. Finland was just beginning to breathe again after a long winter. Lake Bodom, a quiet body of water about 22 kilometers northwest of Helsinki, near the town of Espoo, was a popular weekend spot for families and young people from the capital. There were cabins along one shore, a rowing club, and a wooded area on the western side where campers often pitched tents right at the water's edge. On Saturday, the 4th of June, 4 teenagers set out for that western shore. 2 boys and 2 girls, all between 15 and 18 years old. Seppo Antero Boisman, aged 18, and his girlfriend Tuulikki Mäki, aged 15. Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson, also 18, and his girlfriend Mila Irmeli Bjorklund, 15. They rode out on mopeds, carrying a single tent, sleeping bags, food, and a small amount of alcohol. They chose a spot on a slope above the lake, pitched the tent, and by late evening they were inside it, all 4 sharing one cramped canvas shelter. What happened between midnight and 4 in the morning is the central question of Finnish criminal history. Nobody heard screams. No cabin owner reported gunshots. The nearest houses were not far away, but the acoustics along the lake at that hour, with wind moving through the pines, could swallow a lot of sound. What we know for certain is what was found the next morning. Around 6 in the morning on Sunday, the 5th of June, a group of birdwatchers from Helsinki noticed something wrong at the campsite. The tent was collapsed. It was not standing upright the way a tent should. It had been pushed down over the sleeping bags, and there were dark stains on the canvas. From a distance, the boys thought perhaps someone had been drinking too heavily and knocked the tent over. They rode away, uneasy, and only later did carpenters working nearby raise the alarm properly. When police arrived, what they found was almost impossible to reconstruct as a single coherent crime. Inside the collapsed tent were 3 bodies. Seppo Boisman, Tuulikki Mäki, and Mila Bjorklund had all been attacked with a bladed instrument and, according to the official autopsy, also with blunt force. Mila's body had been pulled partially out of the tent and left on top of the collapsed canvas. The other 2 remained inside. Out of respect for the victims, we will not describe their injuries in detail. What matters for the investigation is this. The pattern of the attack suggested a person or persons acting from outside the tent, striking through the fabric and then moving the tent structure itself. And then there was the 4th teenager. Nils Gustafsson was found alive, sitting or lying on top of the collapsed tent with a broken jaw, facial bruising, and cuts. He was seriously injured, but he was breathing. He would survive. He would also, for the next 44 years, remain the single most important witness and eventually the single most controversial suspect in the entire case. The first mystery is the crime scene itself. There were personal items missing. Nils's shoes were gone. So were the keys to the mopeds and some money. Yet other valuables were left behind. The mopeds themselves had been moved a short distance and, according to some reports, partially hidden in the brush. There were bloodstains outside the tent that suggested the killer or killers had spent time there. But there was no weapon. There was no clear trail leading away into the forest that police could follow with certainty. This was not a case with obvious footprints leading to a suspect's door. Finnish investigators, led by the criminal police of the time, worked the scene as thoroughly as 1960 forensic science allowed. Photographs were taken, blood was typed, Statements were collected from everyone within a reasonable radius, but the technology to do meaningful DNA analysis did not yet exist. Fingerprint work on canvas and outdoor surfaces was extremely limited. In practical terms, the physical evidence that survived the morning of the 5th of June was the evidence that would have to answer the case, whether in 1960 or half a century later. The first suspect the investigation focused on was a local man named Carl Valdemar Gilstrom. He ran a kiosk near the lake and lived in a small house on the western shore, close to the campsite. Neighbors described him as bad-tempered and hostile toward campers. There were stories, difficult to verify decades later, that he had thrown rocks at tents, shouted at young people, and generally regarded the summer visitors as a nuisance. Some witnesses claimed to have seen him near the site that night. Others insisted he had been at home. Gilstrom was questioned. He was not charged. In 1969, 9 years after the murders, he died by drowning in Lake Bodom itself. According to some accounts, a note was later attributed to him in which he claimed responsibility, but this claim has never been solidly documented in the public record, and Finnish investigators have treated it with caution. Officially, he was a person of interest who was never proven to have done anything. The second suspect entered the story later and from a completely different direction. His name was Hans Assmann. Assmann was a German-born man who had lived in Finland for years and had a long, strange history of unexplained movements and rumored intelligence connections. On the day after the murders, he reportedly checked into a Helsinki hospital in a disturbed state, with what witnesses later described as red stains on his clothing. Investigative journalists, most famously the Finnish writer Jorma Palo, argued for decades that Assmann matched the profile of the Bodom killer and that he had been protected from serious scrutiny for political reasons during the Cold War. The Assmann theory became enormously popular in Finnish true crime discussion. It was also, officially, never confirmed. Police did look at him. They did not build a case that survived scrutiny. Assmann died in 1997 without ever being charged. Whether he was a genuine suspect the system failed to pursue, or a compelling character who fit a story the public wanted to believe, remains an open question. Before we get to the third suspect, the one that changed the entire shape of this case in 2004, there is a mini cliffhanger buried in the physical evidence that we need to sit with. Because the strangest thing about Lake Bodom is not who was there. It is what the killer or killers did after the attack. Think about it. 3 teenagers are dead inside a tent. A 4th is unconscious or semi-conscious outside. It is the middle of the night in a forest at the edge of a lake. The obvious behavior for an attacker is to leave, to run. And yet the scene suggests someone stayed. Someone pulled the tent down over the bodies. Someone moved one of the victims. Someone, according to some reconstructions, may have gone through belongings and taken specific items while leaving others. This is not the behavior of a panicked stranger. It is also not obviously the behavior of a professional killer. It sits in an uncomfortable middle space that no theory has ever fully explained. And this brings us to the detail we promised at the start. The third physical detail the investigation could never resolve. It is the state of the tent itself. Multiple analyses over the decades have concluded that the tent was not merely knocked down in a struggle. It appears to have been actively collapsed and arranged over the victims. Yet Nils Gustafsson, the survivor, was found on top of that collapsed tent. Not under it, on top of it. If the killer collapsed the tent while all 4 teenagers were inside, how did Nils end up on the outside surface of the fabric? If Nils was outside when the tent was collapsed, why was he attacked at all? And why was he left alive? Every reconstruction of the crime has to answer that question, and no reconstruction has answered it in a way that satisfies everyone. Veteran Finnish investigators have described this single detail as the one that keeps the case open in their minds, even now. Which brings us to the year 2004, 44 years after the murders. Finnish police reopened the case using modern forensic methods, including DNA analysis of preserved evidence and re-examination of bloodstain patterns on clothing that had been kept in storage since 1960. And in a decision that stunned the country, they arrested Nils Gustafsson himself, the survivor, the boyfriend, the witness. The man who had lived for 4 decades as one of the victims of Lake Bodom was now charged with the murders of his 3 companions. The prosecution's theory was that Nils, in a fit of jealousy or rage, had attacked the other 3 inside the tent, and that his own injuries were the result of the fight, or were self-inflicted or exaggerated. They argued that the pattern of bloodstains on his clothing was inconsistent with the story of a sleeping victim ambushed from outside. They pointed to the fact that he had been found on top of the collapsed tent, not under it, as physical evidence that his position at the moment of the attack was not what he had always claimed. And they pointed to his survival itself. Why him? Why only him? The trial took place in 2005 at the Espoo District Court. It was one of the most closely watched criminal trials in modern Finnish history, and it ended with an acquittal. The court ruled that the prosecution had not proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. The bloodstain evidence was contested by defense experts. The theory that a 15-year-old boy, seriously injured, could have killed 3 people and staged the scene was considered plausible by some experts and implausible by others. Nils Gustafsson was awarded compensation for the time he had spent in custody. He walked out of the courthouse still, officially, a survivor. And that is where the case stands today, officially unsolved. 3 teenagers murdered on the shore of a Finnish lake in 1960. 1 survivor, tried and acquitted decades later. 2 other named suspects, both dead, neither ever charged. A collapsed tent, a set of missing shoes, a set of unexplained movements, and 1 detail about who was found on top of the fabric that nobody has ever resolved to universal satisfaction. There are theories that go beyond the 3 main suspects. Some researchers have pointed to the possibility of more than 1 attacker, based on the sheer speed with which the assault must have happened. Others have suggested a random encounter with a drifter or a soldier from a nearby area. Some have raised the possibility that the crime was connected to a completely unrelated conflict that the teenagers stumbled into. Each theory has supporters. None has evidence strong enough to close the case. Finnish police have not publicly named a new prime suspect since the 2005 acquittal. What makes Lake Bodom endure in the Finnish and international imagination is not only the brutality of what happened, it is the specific texture of the mystery. 4 people go into a tent, 3 die, 1 lives. The one who lives spends most of his adult life as a victim, then briefly as the accused, then as an acquitted man carrying a story he says he cannot fully remember. The lake is still there. The campsite area is still accessible. People still walk those paths in summer. And somewhere in the archives of the Finnish criminal police, in evidence boxes that have now survived longer than most of the people who first handled them, the physical traces of that June morning still wait for a forensic technique that has not yet been invented. We have covered the timeline. We have covered the 3 suspects, Carl Valdemar Gillström, Hans Assmann, and Nils Gustafsson. We have covered the collapsed tent, the missing shoes, the moved mopeds, and the position of the survivor on top of the fabric. What we cannot cover, because nobody can, is the name of the person who walked away from Lake Bodom at dawn on the 5th of June 1960. That person may have died decades ago. That person may still be alive. The case file is not closed. If this case stayed with you, do one small thing: subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we take another unsolved case, walk it through the same careful timeline, and separate what is documented from what is only theory. The next case is already in preparation, and it is closer to home than most people realize.